see that we have people here. I can see that we have people here from Russia, from Kazakhstan, from Canada, of course, from the States, and from UK. There may well be other countries represented here because I don't know everybody that's joined us so far. But welcome to everybody. This is the third webinar in a sequence of webinars which the International Centre of Excellence for Community Schools is convening. And it's a bit different from the previous two. The first one, we had presentations from various people talking about building community support and political will. And there we were looking at how do we promote community schools and who do we need to have on our side to do it. A lot of people have written to me since saying how much they enjoyed that. The second one was a summary of research findings which we have to date, and we had 3 people presenting from that. One from the States, one from the UK, and one from Wales. This one is different because in this one we have, as Doug said, a roundtable discussion looking at social inclusion. And I'm doing it this way for 2 reasons. One is because I think it will be helpful for us to have different styles of working together. And the other reason is because I think the whole issue of social inclusion is so vast, very controversial, as we all know, and people are coming at it from all sorts of different angles. And I thought it would be useful, rather than making an assumption that the people who are listening know what we're talking about, that we make a start by just sharing our ideas together, and I suppose using this session to build an agenda for the future. So the first thing I thought we might need to just discuss before we get into anything practical is some of the terminology. We use all kinds of terminology such as social inclusion, social exclusion, equal opportunities, community cohesion. There are all kinds of terminology used, and I'm just wondering if what we're understanding by this terminology. For example, I know that when I use the word social inclusion, I'm tending to think about it in terms of people's access in relation to community schools to the curriculum or to the services which community schools will use. But I know that if you are applying for funds from the European Union, for example, then social inclusion generally means your closeness to or your distance from the labour market. So that might not include certain groups that would not be eligible for work, so children, for example, or adults over pensionable age, for example. So I thought it might be helpful if we just talked for a few minutes about how we're understanding the term social inclusion so that we're all talking to each other from the same starting point. Does anybody want to be able to help us out on that? Does anybody like to say how they understand social inclusion? Is everybody's microphone working, or is it that people are shy? I can't believe that. I know some of you, and I know you're not shy.
Well, perhaps, Chris, I could start by referring to the paper that is out of Australia. I found it an excellent discussion, and I excerpted a couple of things. And I think you're right. People are coming at this from a number of different angles, and attachment to the labor market or socioeconomic status or poverty is probably the primary driver of many conversations. But people can be excluded from the center of things, from the mainstream, because of their race or their culture or their language, even though their economic situation may be all right, they may be excluded for those other reasons. And so or you have exclusion by virtue of geography. You're in an isolated rural community with fewer resources, and perhaps that's where the community resources, community cohesion discussion comes in. And so it's quite a complex topic. And the paper that I used for the basis for our draft glossary term is just an excellent overview of that from around the world, citing several different approaches to it, including the European Union, including the work that was done in the U.S. and in England, and so on. So I would refer people to that paper as well as to the little summary that we used from that paper. I think one of the implications, though, for me at least, as I read that, and Chris, it was quite similar to the summary that you sent me, was that if schools are going to address these different forms of exclusion, they're going to need partners. And so we need to be cognizant of working with those various sectors who have been working on those various angles or issues for a number of years. And that means the schools will have to have multiple partners in addressing social exclusion or inclusion.
Thank you, Doug. Does anybody want to add anything to that?
Chris?
Yes?
Okay, I just want to explain what we do mean under social inclusion in Kazakhstan and maybe some Russian-speaking countries. Mm-hmm. It's based on the old history of special schools. For example, I, as a normal student, studied at normal school, public school, but if there were some people in my class who were not able to study as fast as the whole other classroom, they were sent to special classes, and then they might be sent to special schools, which were not in same community. They might be 100 kilometers far from the village or the settlement or even the city. So right now we have this kind of strange system when if child is not really normal, if he has a lack of attention or if he has some kind of little deviations in his educational or psychological structure, so then he or she will be sent in special schools. So when we think about inclusion, we think that it should be stopped because those kids, they usually are normal, pretty normal, and they can study with other kids. They just need a little more attention. But unfortunately, it's a long process, and this is what we are trying to do. That's all.
Thank you very much, Anara. Yes, I'm familiar with this idea that in many of the countries that I'm working with at the moment, in those from the former Soviet Union, I see that when I use the term social inclusion, people are normally talking about the reintegration of people with physical disabilities or with learning difficulties, who, as you say, have either been excluded from education altogether or have been in special schools, when maybe they could be integrated into mainstream. And certainly that's one aspect of social inclusion. But as Doug pointed out when he was talking about the article that we can see the link to on the screen, when we talk about social inclusion in many other countries, we're also talking about issues around gender, around race, around ethnicity, around religion, around poverty and disadvantage, around sexuality, and other causes for people feeling that they are at some distance from what everybody else is able to access. And so when we're talking about the practical application of social inclusion, we're looking to work out what those barriers are and how we might remove them. And one of the issues is around perception and how people who are in the mainstream see those other groups, and indeed maybe how some of those groups themselves see themselves. And Anara, you said that it's a long process of re-engaging people with disabilities in Kazakhstan and in some of the other countries that we've mentioned. And I'm wondering if you could just say for a moment why you think it is a long process. Are there practical reasons, or do you think that there are cultural reasons why it is taking a long time?
Okay, I will try to explain. For my personal opinion, this is a long process because, first of all, we have those special schools. Special in meaning that they are exclusive, but exclusive in very negative way. The kids with physical, for example, and a little physical, and big physical, and people with kids with some educational deviations, they study there. And government actually pays money for those. It's a special, how to say, money flow which goes from Ministry of Education. And those schools, they were working at least last 50 years. So on the way of governmental, of the governmental way, it's very hard to invert it and make that those money will go inside of public schools where other normal kids study, and where, for example, same teachers who were working in those special exclusive schools will be working with same devoted and just kids with special disability, special needs, and they can be working in normal schools. But this is a long process. This is one way. And second way, yes, it's cultural because we have this kind of culture of separating kids who are a little bit different from other kids, and it's not only on teachers level, it's also on relatives level, it's also on kids level, and yes, this is part of culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Anara. Would anybody else like to add to this?
I'd like to respond. It's Carol. I'm in New York, and I'm speaking from the U.S. perspective. I'm fascinated by Anara's comments because in the States there's been many, many, many years of activity to mainstream students, which is exactly what she's talking about, taking the children who were in non-normal environments and isolated classrooms or schools and integrate them with everybody else. And it's had many successes, but there is an enormous amount of pushback that it causes problems with the acceptance of these children within classrooms, within schools. So I think it's not an either or, it's a both and question, and it does take a lot of time. On a very practical level, I'm enormously grateful to have this sort of platform to be pushed into my thinking. I've been doing a lot of exploration because there's a huge activity going on around anti-bullying and issues around inclusion and exclusion in this language, especially because of the major shooting of children in an elementary school. And there's been a lot of work done on social emotional intelligence, and that really is the practical way to address how people learn to live together. And I don't know how to marry the two, but I think that there is some connection between this conversation, social inclusion and exclusion, and in schools going beyond the academic measures and really focusing on the being and the social emotional culture and skills around that within schools. So I'd love to know if anybody has found anything in that area as well.
Thank you. Bill, I think you might have something to say.
Bill, I think you might
I
have
know
something
this
to
is
say.
something that you've been working
I know
on.
this is something that you've been working on.
Yes, this is Bill Malley, and I'm speaking from Coventry in England, in the UK. What Chris is referring to, one of the organisations I work for, called Diversity Hub, runs programs that work on some important aspects of what has been described as perhaps cultural, and also some of the issues that Carol is raising. So if you take the work we've done on bullying, and the discussions we encourage with both students and teachers and adult workers in schools, we explore how language is used in the schools and the classrooms, and what's often emerges is what some people have called harmless banter, can very quickly escalate into a kind of a name calling, which exacerbates differences between children, and those peer pressures develop in a way that exclude individuals and groups, and becomes the thin edge of the wedge to move towards bullying and harassment, which is an aspect of social inclusion or exclusion. And if one of the areas of work that we've started to explore, which hasn't been touched on, is those people who suffer from mental health conditions, and how, as a rule, certainly within the UK, that is an unspoken and unrecognised condition, and it's, as a rule, something you don't speak about, because to talk about it sets you apart from others, which is another kind of social exclusion, and particularly for some of the conditions you suffer from, say depression, which in itself tends to isolate people. You become doubly isolated, not only with the condition, but the fact that you can't talk to people about it because they look down on you. But these cultural issues can be addressed by celebrating difference and diversity. So our experience of working with a room full of essentially white people, we can explore with them the differences that exist in the room, which many of them just aren't aware of, but form important parts of their lives, and celebrate those differences. And very quickly people come to understand. They get back in touch with what we would describe as some essential elements of their humanity, and it gives them strength to relate to others that they might not immediately warm to, and are traditionally viewed as separate or even different from themselves.
Thank you, Bill. That's very helpful. So far, what I've heard, to sum up at this point, we've touched upon there being vested interests. So there are already systems in place which might not be very helpful, but breaking them down is difficult because there's an interest in maintaining the status quo. Secondly, there are issues about perception and the culture. Nara referred to this, I think, when she was talking about people with disabilities, but equally we can use that in terms of any other group of people. And thirdly, just starting to look at some practical steps around this. We've talked a little bit about anti-bullying policies and programs that will help children themselves to develop their own perceptions and their own strengths in relation to their own situation. I think there may also be some practical ways in which head teachers and their staff can attempt to break down some of the barriers. Does anybody have any input on that they would like to make? I'm thinking, for example, I know that certainly in this country, and I suspect in some other countries too, that when you have a new group of immigrants, for example, and the children start to attend schools, the parents, the existing parents, are often upset if they feel that the culture of the school is beginning to change. And very often, for example, we hear of parents who don't want their own children to learn about other religions, or they don't want to see that their children are attending various multicultural events. And it seems to me that there's a role here that the school can play in terms of not just working with the children, which is very important, but also reaching out and helping to change perceptions in the wider community. Does anybody here have an example of how that might work?
Chris, it's Doug. Maybe just to bring that point up to a slightly different level. In our work internationally on health promoting schools and with other frameworks, we think it's very important that we not try to place the burden of any particular problem just on the school. We advocate for a systems-based approach that engages not only the schools but also the school boards and the ministries of education and so on, but also other systems, health, welfare, social services, employment, in addressing that problem. And so I think we need to be conscious of that so that we can try to make our changes systematic and not rely on the individual efforts at the school level. And so in the materials, in the statement that we're developing, and I've been editing as we've been speaking, what we try to do is look at other ways of engaging those systems to work with schools. And that means going in and talking their language. So if we're addressing, for example, the inclusion of special needs students, there's a whole body of players and actors and systems and policies around that issue that we need to draw from and attach ourselves to in order to make significant change. Or if we're looking at bullying, there's a whole safe schools movement that's addressed bullying for a number of years, and more recently in many countries there's been a focus on bullying derived from discrimination by sexual orientation. And so that's another, so that again there are many players, there's a number of ideas, and so I think we need to be cognizant of those and try to use that systems approach. Otherwise, because we're going to need allies to make the school a better place. It's not going to happen but on its own.
Thank you, Doug. And I think that leads us on very well to the question about building up partnerships, because indeed schools trying to fight this on their own are fighting a losing battle, and it all depends too much on the strengths of personality and the enthusiasms of a particular head teacher. And you're quite right that when both public policy and various agencies are signed up to working on these issues together, then I think we can start helping the schools to become much more effective in breaking down these barriers, not just inside the school, as you say, but also working with parents and the wider community. Does anybody have any particular examples of where this has worked reasonably well?
Chris, I'm sorry. Can we a little bit like? Can you repeat this question? But what we have to talk about?
What we're saying, Anara, is that it's impossible when we're looking at perceptions in the public perceptions of the issues around social inclusion to expect the school on its own to tackle those. So, for example, if you say that we know that in some parts of Russia, for example, people are quite anxious about the integration of children with special needs. And they don't want to see these children integrated into the schools that their own children attend. What can be done about that? It's not something which the school can tackle on its own. It needs to be part of public policy, and part of public policy means that all the services are working together and that the thinking behind that is made available to everyone so that no head teacher is working alone and expected to tackle society's ideas on their own, but are working with other partners. And for example, if I look at some of the examples that I know we have here in the UK, many of our schools have reached out and talked to, say, for example, Muslim communities here, and made attempts at bringing in people from the Muslim community to work with children in schools, so that there's an opportunity for parents and for children who are non-Muslim to learn a bit more about what being a Muslim is all about, because there's so much false information out there that this way it can be tackled. That's one small way in which schools have tried to work with agencies in partnership to address one particular issue. And I'm wondering if anyone listening has others that they can draw upon.
Chris, it's Doug here. I wonder if sorry, if we could if you could make sure I'm getting a microphone. So if you make sure your microphone's off, I wonder if we could take a look at the document that I summarized out of Australia. I think it captures much of what we've talked about quite a bit, and it really does look at the different forms of exclusion, and suggests that poverty economics are the access to the employment is the primary driver, but there's many other forms of exclusion that need to be addressed. And I think that might be a way of organizing our thoughts and our actions, following up on the notion that we have to work with other systems. We can then organize how we respond to particular forms of exclusion. For example, in one country, as noted, they may be in the process of moving from a segregated approach to special education or special needs students towards a more inclusive approach. And so they would be able to draw from the work that's been done in many different countries about that issue. Or in other cases, it might be looking at countries that are looking at exclusion of immigrants or cultural issues, cultural differences that are driving the dynamics within a school and excluding some. And so there's a body of knowledge and experience about anti-racist education or multicultural education that we could draw from. And so I guess what I'm suggesting is that we need to think about how we can form those partnerships and also draw from the knowledge that's already been gained in those various approaches. And I don't know if I said this before in this discussion, but there are many different frameworks for working with schools. Community schools is one, healthy schools is another. But many of those issues that what we're talking about here in terms of exclusion or inclusion have their own frameworks that we need to understand and to work with in order to be effective. And so I'm wondering, Chris, if we might go to that draft page that I've started to develop. I've actually been editing it and see if that prompts some more discussion. If you're comfortable, we could make that shift. Or we can continue with this. It's up to you, Chris.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I've just clicked on the link, and I can see that there's a table on your document which looks at types of factors causing exclusion and the school multi-intervention approaches on the other side of the table. Is everybody looking at that now, do you think? Because I think there might be some useful links in there for us to be able to look at. When I started this discussion today, I said that I thought that it was a vast issue. Because I think people are coming at it from so many different systems and so many different angles. And it seems to me that if we're going to share our ideas in a practical way, that we ought to break it down, and that here there may be some opportunities for us to do that. It seems to me that we need to be looking at the various barriers that exist for people, the various groups of people who are excluded from learning or from the services which community schools offer. We've listed some of those in terms of ethnicity, in terms of their poverty or rural isolation or disability, etc. And that we might want to, therefore, look at each of those and say to, we might want to look at each of those and start to build links around those issues. Now, Doug, I know that you're an inveterate networker and you seem to have your finger in so many pies, you seem to have so many contacts. On this particular page, will there be, do you know, contacts there that we can build on for future sharing?
As you know, Chris, we've been trying to make those connections with a number of school-related groups and networks and movements around the world. So the short answer is yes, but they won't be found on this particular page. You'll find from this page a number of documents that have been published internationally that are published by a number of those groups. And so if I've now clicked so that people are now, you should be able to see the document on the screen, and you'll see the various aspects of exclusion there, and you'll see I've actually added, based on our earlier discussion, I've pulled out the exclusion based on learning ability or disability and pointed that out. But Chris, I do have a comment from Inera that she's pointed out that she's got a name for their name for alternative schools that work on exclusion is called the Adaptive Networking School, and it's one of the alternative schools that is noted in the document. But so I think in terms of this discussion today, and the Australian document, which is noted at the very bottom of the page that I've been working on, it's a 2009 document. Has identified several of these forms of exclusion in the chart, although I have added others based on our conversation today and based on our own work. And I think it's important that we slice it so that we can address it in a systems way and also in a practical way. So, Chris, I don't know if that's helpful in continuing the conversation. I was very impressed by the Australian paper, and I think it points us in the right direction of trying to address different forms of exclusion, not separately, but at least one or two at a time.
Mm. Thank you, Doug. Yes, I think that's very useful. One of the things I would like to suggest is that I know that amongst us, we will all have, either from our own organization or from others that we work with, very practical materials that can be used that will help us to break down some of these barriers. And I'm thinking that it would be a jolly good idea to have them up on these websites so that other people can access them. So I would like to see, I don't know how other people feel, that if we look at this page here, that adding to this page, we would then have a bibliography or a list of websites where we can get hold of practical materials, activities, frameworks, etc., that will help us rather than having to invent them all ourselves all over again. How do people feel about that? Bill, I think you were about to say something.
Yeah, yes, thanks, Chris. It's Bill Malley again from Coventry in England. I think I want to just pass over, Chris, I think the question you're posing about resources for a moment, just to come back to something that Doug is saying about the Australian document, and one of the things I take from the Australian document, and if I'm understanding it, the brief look I've had at the brief opportunity I've had to look at it, is that it lists potentially 9 different forms or factors on which people might be excluded. And Doug rightly suggests that you're unlikely to address these one at a time, but even addressing them 2 or 3 at a time, the proposition is there might be at least 3 sets of strategies to address just this list. And it strikes me that this list is not comprehensive, and it often feels to me when we're talking about aspects of exclusion or inclusion, that we continue to classify people into certain kinds of groups who suffer some kind of disadvantage. And in one sense, that's completely accurate and true. And in one level, this classification just continues to make it more and more difficult for us to respond positively to people and communities in a more holistic way. Now, I guess I raised that as an observation. So I would want us to address issues of race and tackle anti-racist work. I'd want us to tackle issues of gender and sexuality and of economic circumstance and poverty or academic underachievement. I mean, children are excluded in school by their lack of academic achievement. So I guess there's a tension in this for me, which I can't fully answer, that I'm raising.
Chris, if I could respond, I think that's a really excellent point, and refer a little bit to our experience in developing a consensus statement on how to address disadvantage and disparities and social determinants. We did a consensus statement with started here in Canada with the community schools movement and the healthy schools movement, and we had a conference about it, and we had a working group, and then we took it to the international level, and so that statement is referred to in this draft. But but we had quite a discussion about the point that Bill made, that we shouldn't be taking a deficit model. We shouldn't be identifying people only by their problems, and we need to have maintain that holistic approach. And so we adapted in the conversations we had. We adapted. We don't only try to look at their deficits or their problems affecting a particular group of people, but also the strengths and both in their communities and in their families that we can build on. But we also tried to group things according to particular contexts, and I think that the nature of the challenges and the strengths in any community is dependent upon their context. And so in the draft statement, you'll see that I've started to refer to 3 different contexts, which I think are important to bring into the process of choosing what you want to focus on without losing your holistic vision. And the work we did on that consensus statement in 2010 was on disadvantaged communities in high-income countries, which is one context. And we pulled together the challenges they face and the strengths they can work with, and then tried to list the many different kinds of programs that can be effective in that context. Others have done similar work on a different scale. There is a lot of work that's been done internationally on low-income countries, or developing countries as they used to be called. And so there is a UN agency framework that is used for that. And I guess in terms of exclusion, we were talking about how those almost entire countries are excluded from the mainstream of global progress because of the lack of resources they have, although not all those low-income countries, those low-income countries are not always uniform. There's other communities within those countries that have quite a few resources. But anyway, so that's another kind of a context. And then there's again a third context, which has brought together many agencies, and they call it education for emergencies or education in emergencies, and that's for countries that have suffered from a natural disaster or an epidemic or war or conflict. And so it's really a recovery and emergency management kind of approach. There might be a fourth here, Chris, that is somewhere different, somewhat different. And there are countries who are going through a renaissance, who are rebuilding their societies, that had a lot more resources and a lot more had a lot of institutions that have declined and then now are coming back. And so that might be, again, a different context. And so going to Bill's point, I think we need to keep the holistic approach and not just identify people or groups by their problems, but work from a strength-based approach. But also we need to be really cognizant of the context we're working in, because that will often lead us to making the right choices about the kinds of exclusion that we're going to try to address and the kinds of programs that we may be wanting to try to use. And the good thing is that there's a lot of work that's already been done in these things, and we can draw from that in having conversations about this issue.
Doug, I wonder if I could, and I'm going to sound, forgive me, I don't know you, I'm going to sound a little bit, I don't know, perhaps anti-bureaucratic here. I've been involved in a whole range of initiatives that produce statements of intent. And some of those are useful in terms of the direction of travel and us broadly agreeing what we might be endeavouring to achieve. And some of the discussion today has included some issues that might be what might be viewed as school systems issues about how a nation or a community organises its schools. And also a lot of the issues that emerge for how individuals act come down to what happens in the classroom that the statements of intent don't often address. So they come down to really practical issues about how a teacher or the teacher's assistants are with the pupils and the other adults that they're working with. So I would be particularly interested, and maybe this comes back to part of what Chris was saying, and forgive me Chris, I kind of bumped away from it. I would be particularly interested in examples of good practice in schools or educational programs that happened in classrooms that were essentially inclusive, that treated people well, whoever they are, that weren't necessarily anti-racist, but they would be inherently anti-racist. They weren't necessarily responding to gender issues directly, but would, as a matter of course, treat boys and girls, men and women in a more equitable way as we did business. So there is something about examples of practice that I would be drawn to as a practitioner and an organisation, which isn't quite the same, I think, as the consensus statement, even a holistic one that you might be flagging, and forgive me for that.
Do you want to respond to that, Doug?
Sure. Yeah, and Chris, I'm smiling, or Bill, I'm smiling. It's a good discussion, and we actually are on the same wavelength. When we developed that consensus statement for disadvantaged communities in high-income countries, Delphine Melchert, who is the president of the Community Schools Association here in Canada, and I both agreed that we weren't going to try to develop yet another framework. A broad framework for directions, but we were actually going to point people to good practices and good programs that can be used in communities, communities in high-income countries. And so, if you go to that document, you'll see that we've identified. We haven't fully elaborated on them, but we've identified a number of very practical things that have worked in those kinds of contexts. And a real easy example is school meal programs or Head Start, Early Start programs, and so on. And there's about 25 different kinds of better practices, better programs that we identified in that statement. The value of the statement only is by grouping them together in a way that's relevant to that context, that particular type of context. It's then enables people to look through their situation, identify the priorities in their community, and then go to this range of interventions that are proven to be effective and try to develop them. But then there is a whole process of change, which I think Bill is also pointing to, in terms of it comes down to working your way through all the way from the top down to the bottom or sideways in terms of getting the systems to adopt those particular interventions and to maintain them. And that's another kettle of fish. But what we tried to do in that initial discussion was identify very practical things that have been working in disadvantaged communities in high-income countries. And I think that's incumbent. Otherwise, we don't need another document. We don't need another framework. And Bill, it's a good discussion, and it would be great to get to know you better.
Thank you.
Okay, so it seems to me that what we've talked about so far is that we have this vast area. We need to try and contextualize it. We need to have some kind of agreement, and some of that work has already happened. We've got this article in front of us, which is starting to list the kind of issues and the kind of approaches. We've got the consensus statement, which Doug has referred to, and I hope, Doug, that at the end of this session you can point us in the direction of this consensus statement so that we'll be able to find it for ourselves. And we've also got the question that I think both in different ways, both Bill and myself have raised, which is what can we learn from each other that is practical, that will have practical application, that we don't have to keep reinventing for ourselves. So what can we learn, for example, in Kazakhstan about the integration of children with special needs that maybe, Carol, in the USA, you have already dealt with? How can they learn from your successes and your mistakes? Is there anything in the work that you've done or that you have available there in the States that they can pick up on, for example? And it occurs to me that one thing that we could do together when we finish this webinar is search through our bibliographies and make sure that that's available. Now, would this page that you have here, Doug, be a good place for us to list our bibliography? Where could we send our contacts and our web pages to, would you say is the best place?
Well, I think it would be just send them to either Chris or myself, and I will undertake to organize them and place them up. We've also, Chris, as you know, we've started a master bibliography on community schools, which is quite extensive. So I would be happy to extract from emails or documents and place it into that. It's basically a list of both research and tools, practical tools. And that could be perhaps and social inclusion is one of the topics within that master list that we could build. But I think we could easily do that, and then perhaps take some of that material and look again at this draft, what we're calling a glossary term, you know, a short, brief statement of what we're talking about. But I did want to come back to, before we leave it, and I think it's a comment. It's a comment from Anera, and she began with asking if we have a blog which we could continue this conversation. But her comment continued, where she talks about some work done in Kazakhstan in terms of the Assembly of Nations. And it goes to the point I was making earlier, that I think if we looked at the context of situations similar to Eastern Europe, that are rebuilding societies, that have a long history of civilization, and it's different than it's different than Canada, high-income countries like Canada, or it's different than low-income countries, or it's different from countries who are actually just in the throes of dealing with a disaster or a conflict. But I think the context is different, and I think the work that, and Chris, I know you're working with several countries in Eastern Europe, that it's a different kind of context, and maybe we can build our own, consensus statement just on that context. How can that context address social inclusion in a way that's unique to those kinds of countries? And that might, that's a fourth context that has not yet been well articulated at the international level, that your group could work on.
Thank you, Doug. Yes, I have 2 points in relation to that. As some of you will know, but there are other people who will be joining this discussion or listening to the recorded version later. One of the partnerships, which is an international partnership, involves countries such as Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, Bosnia, Czech Republic, Armenia, Kazakhstan, and others. And together we have worked on international quality standards for community schools, which is going to appear on this Schools for All site shortly. And one of the aspects that we've looked at is social inclusion. And we have some quite basic indicators there, which, for example, if I just read one of them. Social inclusion is an integral part of school policies and practices. So any community school could look at that and say, well, do we have social inclusion as a part of our policy? Are we clear about what we're doing around this in our context? And there are some descriptors underneath that standard that teachers would be able to look at, and indeed look at with their pupils, with their parents and with other agencies to check out if they are actually following that. So I think that's going to be very helpful in terms of practice at the school level, a check for people. But you're quite right, Doug, that articulating this for countries that I'm working with at the moment is proving to be a very interesting topic, because as Anara said when she first joined this discussion, if you use the term social inclusion at the moment, the immediate thought is about the engagement of children with special needs. So I think the idea of being able to talk in our partnership about social inclusion and what we mean by it in a broader sense, and start to draw on all these wider issues, is going to be very helpful, I think, in terms of helping the work of those countries to broaden out now into these other issues, as well as feeding back to us ways in which they're going to tackle that both at policy level and on the ground. So I think that's a useful discussion. I still would like to ask, though, that everybody that participates here and those who listen to the recorded version, I would hope that we can all send in our bibliographies, our websites, our ideas for practical support. And I think picking up on what you said, Bill, the idea that we try and pick out really practical examples at classroom level, or certainly at school level, which addresses these issues in an effective way, is something that we would all like to have access to and to be able to share.
Sorry, Chris, my timing is poor. I mean, I'm happy to share information about Diversity Hub. I don't think we quite fit. Well, I say I don't think we quite fit. We don't quite fit the image I have of community schooling or community schools. But we are interested in learning and education in its broadest sense, and to picking up on one of the themes we haven't really addressed that Doug's encouraged us to think about, which is working in partnership as an organisation that's essentially usually outside of schools and trying to get in. Partnership issues are critical to us in terms of relationships with schools. And just to reinforce the importance of working with the wider community, there's an organisation in the UK called the Joseph Rowntree Foundation that does a lot of interesting research on a number of aspects of learning and education, and they would assert that within the UK, 90% of the factors that determine pupils' school performance are actually outside of the school. So if you're looking to change or improve school performance in some way, there is a need to get beyond, and often beyond the school boundary, and to influence what happens there. And I think Doug is right. Those usually involve other agencies and other resources that are beyond the school boundaries.
Thank you. I think we're coming to a natural close here shortly. I'm taking from what I've heard that together we can share our understanding, and I'm taking on board Doug's idea of looking at, I think you call them Renaissance countries, which is a very nice term. Such as those that I'm working with at the moment in the former Soviet Union. I think as well that we also have a plea for looking at programs that are proving to be effective at school level and at classroom level. And I think also we need to be looking at examples that we have of effective partnerships between the schools and other agencies, maybe other public policy agencies, such as health, for example, but also other non-government organizations representing perhaps the interests of particular communities, ethnic minorities or women or whatever. And so those three things, I think, are ones that we might pursue. I should say, too, that as accompanying our international quality standards, we are collecting at the moment practical case studies, and those too are going to be part of what we put on this site as well. So please, please do add any that you have available to the site when it's when we've got it up and running properly. In the meantime, you can send them to myself or to Doug. So any examples that you can point to, please send them to me, please send them to Doug, and very soon we'll be putting them up on this site. I would also like to ask people to, we've tried this method of having an open discussion rather than a sequence of presentations on this webinar. And I know that some people have joined in, although not everyone has wanted to. But I would welcome, again, any feedback that you have on this method of conducting a webinar, or whether or not, instead of having an open discussion, we should have a much more narrowly focused discussion, or whether you would prefer to return to formal presentations followed by question and answer sessions. I'd be really interested to learn from you what your feelings are about these ways of conducting webinars, because those of you who know me will know that I'm just learning how to do this. Does anybody want to come back before we wrap up?
Chris, just 2 quick points. I've posted the in the chat box. I posted the link to the bibliography /toolbox that we're trying to build on community schools. People can. We haven't added much there, but we'll try to populate that as quickly as possible. So if you send me any good tools, any good resources, any good research articles or studies that you know of, I'll be happy to post them and link them in that quite extensive list. And 2, I think we've reckoned in this conversation, I've learned again, as I always do in these conversations, this is a very, very broad topic that concerns us all. We need to perhaps build on the kind of work that has already been done by the International Center and by this good paper in Australia in terms of trying to organize it into ways that we can actually address it in terms of the types of exclusion that that need to be addressed in a holistic way, but also in a 1 by 1 or 1 and 2 at a time. And then I think building on the idea of looking at that in different contexts, I will revise the statement a bit and add another context, what we've now called Renaissance countries, and maybe Chris, then we can have subsequent conversations about how those countries who are in the middle of a renaissance are able to address this issue of social inclusion, and I think that would be a very good contribution to the international dialogue and very helpful. I'll be happy to try to take that forward to the many networks that we work with as well. So I think it's been a good initial conversation about this very broad topic, and I think we can take some next steps following this session. Please encourage, and one last little ad for the Wikipedia style website that we're working on. Please go in and add your comments, or you can even go in and edit it. All versions of the document or the summary are retained. It's kind of like a Word document. So please feel free to just click on, if you look at the very top of all the pages in the Wikipedia style website, there's a little pencil there called Easy Edit, and you just click on that and you can go in and edit the text. Or you can go up and comment on the discussions by clicking on discussions and then finding the thread we have on community schools, either one. So I know people are not, and most people go and look, but we don't actually, most people don't actually contribute a comment or an edit, but please do. Well, it would be very helpful to continue the conversation in that way. So back to you, Chris.
Thank you, Doug. Yes, and if you look at this Schools for All sites, these wiki pages, there is a section on community schools. That is going to be updated quite substantially by the end of January. There will be, I hope, a fairly comprehensive lead article. It will continue with our thinking so far around the various aspects of the standards, things like leadership, this one of course, social inclusion, partnership, lifelong learning. There are 9 standards, and there will be a short introduction to each one of those. And again, everyone is welcome to join in, to post your stuff, to tell us about events that are happening. But I'll be contacting you after this session just to remind you what we've said, and also to invite any of you who want to participate in building up this the consensus statement, or to share other events, or to share any information that you have. Anara, I'd like to get back to you to take up the challenge that Doug has set us there to discuss social inclusion in terms of Kazakhstan. And I know that Elena tried to join us, and then she appeared to leave. I don't know quite why. Maybe she had some technical problem, but I know that Elena in Russia is also keen to be part of this. So we've got 3 of us already, I'm pretty sure, Doug, because I think Anara will be, I hope, will be ready to join us in this discussion. Am I right, Anara?
Okay, I just want to come back to what you said before, if I want to share something. And it's not me who wants to share, it's Gulbarshin who wants to share. Because after one of comments she said that, again, the case study which we sent, it was about networking adoptive school, where we tried to explain how our NGO, as one of the NGO working on building community active schools and developing them, working together with other schools which are already community active schools and schools which are not. And she said that this is a perfectly nice example of what I think Doug was asking, or maybe Bill was asking, about partnership between NGO, school, and agencies. And in that point, there are National Assembly of Nations in Kazakhstan is one of the biggest NGO which has small houses of friendship all over the Kazakhstan. They're also working together with us, but not in really good partnership. We just sometimes gather together when we have our traditional holidays, when we want to involve all the nations of Kazakhstan, which are 145. When I say nations, it's not the Kazakhs. I mean ethnical people, people of different ethnicity background, like Russians, Ukrainians, Kazakh, who are living in Kazakhstan, and other small nations. So yes, I would like to join any discussion. I personally like to participate in that, because this way I can translate to Gulbarshin and translate from her back her ideas. She will be not able to speak English, fluent, so via me she can share a few ideas from Kazakhstan. This is what I want to say. Thank you.
Well, that sounds to me like a really good result. So I'm really delighted to hear that, Anara. Carol, I know that you have a lot of experience in South Africa as well, which you might want to share with us too. And so I'm hoping to hear from you about that. And I know you've also been working here in London. So again, any information that you have, anything that you would like to share with us. I can see that, I think Carol is writing something that I'm not able to see. Am I right?
Yes, she's going to be sending some information, and she adds her thanks for the session.
Okay. Keep an eye on this space, because we have a webinar roughly about once a month. The next one I think that we're going to be looking at is partnerships, which follow on from what we've been talking about now. So again, the issue that you've just raised, Anara, about your large NGO that you work with, that would, I think, be very useful to hear more about, and I'm sure that we've all got examples of partnership. So keep an eye on this space, keep visiting our wiki pages here, join in, feel free to write anything, write to me personally, or put your ideas on these pages, and talk to you again soon, I hope. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.